We over here, yeah, it's behind the deal. We are keeping it real. Today it is episode 2. We got Diana Florance. Let's watch it now.
Welcome to episode 2 Behind the Deal. Today, I'm joined by somebody who for 25 years worked at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. She's a former candidate for the Manhattan District Attorney's Office as well, and now she works at Shoemaker Law Firm. Everyone, please welcome Diana Florance.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's great to be here.
Okay, so, that's just what I've gathered from Diana, but I'll let her tell her story for a little bit, and then we'll jump into some questions. So take it away.
Okay. So yeah, great to be here. I am a almost 31-year lawyer. I'm from New York, but I went to undergrad and law school at the University of North Carolina. While at Carolina, I majored in Spanish and art history and only knew that I wanted to be a litigator, didn't have a particular area of law I was passionate about. Upon going to law school, I found myself in criminal law. Actually worked in the defense law clinic, and I speak fluent Spanish because I spent my junior year in Spain. And back in the 90s, they didn't provide translators, so I was I was serving not only as a lawyer but also as a vital link between immigrants who were being at that time really targeted by small town sheriffs and things like that, not so much in Chapel Hill but in the surrounding county, which was much more rural. That work led me to think about working in the criminal law space, but decided to become a prosecutor rather than a defense attorney because in New York, I felt that, New York had just been sort of changing. It had been very high crime, the crack epidemic in the 80s and the early 90s, and it started to recede. But I wanted to be part of the solution of kind of making, New York City, restoring it to what it should be. And so I was really lucky in the fall of 1995 to be hired by Robert Morgenthau, who is sort of the legendary district attorney. He served for more than 35 years in the role. And he was, immortalized like on Law and Order, that show. Like they literally had a character that was almost a clone to Morgenthau, and he kind of created the modern prosecutor. And I was really lucky. I got to work in that office for 25 years. But when the pandemic hit, I tried my hand at politics. I didn't win, and then I pivoted to doing something different. And the work I did at the district attorney's office, I did everything from domestic violence to sexual assault to homicides. My latter part of my career, after 9/11, I prosecuted construction fraud, and in the rebuilding of the Trade Center, learned a lot about safety because they were faking the concrete strength of the New World Trade Center and many other buildings. And then that kind of pivoted to worker safety, which led me to find a task force there that sort of focused on wage theft and health and safety violations. And then again, as I said, after the pandemic, I decided to run for DA when it became an open seat, didn't win, and then was sort of looking for something else to do. And what I realized was adjacent was about a week after my election, the Supreme Court, decided a case known as Alston versus NCAA. And that case, that ruling in it, is largely kind of credited to ushering in the NIL era that we're in now. It's not entirely correct. There was a case before that, the O'Bannon case, and there have been subsequent cases, but it's really that was the watershed moment that kind of legalized paying college athletes and has led to kind of the landscape that we're in now, which, albeit is not the best, but there's been a lot of opportunity. And I saw the ability to pivot from, making sure that undocumented construction workers were protected and had a voice, to seeing that Division I athletes who for years were, unpaid and could lose their eligibility, lose their, ability to get an education if they took a free soda. And they were the engines of billion-dollar industry. The NCAA March Madness just ended, and you can see how expensive, how many millions and billions that is, earned, and these athletes, the whole reason that exists, didn't get a piece of that. So that's sort of why I pivoted into this area. I've kind of given you a long meandering, so I can happily, shorten that if you want me to do it again. But that's the answer.
Okay, sounds good. And so how has your mindset kind of changed since you shifted from law enforcement to now representing athletes for NIL?
And it's not that different because I realize that you really do need someone to be fighting for the people that you represent. So, as a government employee, as a prosecutor, my client was technically the people of the state of New York, but and it would be a case would be there would be a victim, and so you would have to balance the victim's kind of situation and making sure they got justice with, of course, the rights of the defendant. In private practice in sports law, it's a little different because, frankly, the NCAA, I don't have to balance their rights at all, frankly. I mean, I have to think about how I'm going to win the case, but it's really a classic sort of power imbalance where all the power relies on one side. And, on the other side of the athlete, you're just trying to kind of point out the inequities and use the law to, make sure that your client, in this case, most of the time the athletes, to a lesser extent the schools, are, not being abused by the more powerful actor of the NCAA.
All right, great. So, what do you think are the biggest legal misconceptions that your athletes or just fans have about NIL deals?
I think that we always hear about the big giant checks, and it sounds like it's just about the bag, if you will. And I would say that there are very, very few, athletes that get seven-figure paychecks, and even ones that get six-figure paychecks. And again, where we are in this space is that there's no regulation and there's no guardrails, but that's not the athlete's fault. That is honestly the NCAA's fault, and I'll explain why. For many, many years, and it might be helpful to even talk about the O'Bannon case and the Alston case. The O'Bannon case was it centered on Ed O'Bannon, who had been a basketball player at UCLA, and then prior to that, or so after that, he was in the NBA, right? And he noticed on on EA Sports, like, that his jump shot, right? He had like a very specific way of kind of getting out in transition or something to that effect. I don't remember the specifics, but it was something that was very much him. He could see right away, and he realized that was his name, image, and likeness. And this video game company was profiting. Like, everyone liked to play 2K, right? It was fun. And he realized, like, hey, we're not getting, I'm not getting a dime from this. Like, they've been, and he'd been out of college for years. And so they brought the case, that, and it was against, EA Sports and the NCAA. What is interesting is that EA settled right away, but the NCAA did not. And that sort of gives you a clue as to the hubris and the kind of, over a century of unrestricted power, unilateral power that the NCAA kind of flexed with really no repercussions. And they thought it was just going to be another example of, squashing this. But instead, it basically led to, a situation where you can't do that anymore. You can't simply use someone's name, image, and likeness and not compensate them. The fact that they were college athletes does not give you the right to do that. But that case was just basically in California in the Ninth Circuit. So that case was before Alston, and that kind of ushered in an area where there were now states were passing laws that said, hey, if you come to California, you come to Texas or wherever, if you're a college athlete, you can get paid, right? But that was kind of in conflict with what the NCAA was saying. No, if you take a soda, you're going to get your eligibility. So the Alston case then came in where I forget the school, I think it was USC, but I think that they basically wanted to give laptops to their athletes, and the NCAA said nope, that's too much. You can't give laptops. We're restricting the level of money, and you can't go beyond that. And you can't give laptops as an educational benefit. And, again, was in California and went to the Ninth Circuit, and it was in district court and the Ninth Circuit, and the NCAA lost. They lost at the trial level, they lost at the circuit level. And then they could have just sort of left it at O'Bannon, like O'Bannon, where there was maybe this conflict, but nothing kind of was super clear, and everything's in California. But again, the hubris of the NCAA was, we're going to appeal this to the Supreme Court, and we're going to get our exemption, and we're going to squash all of it. That's what they thought. What had happened instead is 9-0. So think about that. In the world that we live in right now, where everybody is so divided, you have, Trump versus Mandami, right? You have the polar opposite type of politicians that are very extreme left, extreme right. There's no middle ground anymore, right? Everyone has an extreme view. And the Supreme Court is a little bit of a microcosm of that, right? There are 6 conservative justices and 3 liberal ones. And the liberal ones, they're often voted against, and they dissent, and everything's very strong. And yet, in the Alston case, the vote in favor of the athlete and the educational benefits was 9-0, all of them unanimously against the NCAA. And why that was, you have Justice Kavanaugh in a concurrence calling the NCAA basically a monopolist. That they're the epitome. Oh, actually, a monopsonist, because it's not the labor side. But the point is, the monopsonist is a labor person as opposed to a material product side. But the point is, they were violating antitrust. Everyone saw that right away. And it was, if the NCAA hadn't simply, gone with their hubris thinking that they could get a great ruling and they could go back to business as usual, and if they had instead engaged with schools, engaged with athletes, and said, hey, we're going to allow you to have, maybe we're going to allow each kid to get, I don't know, $100,000 in dealership, deals with the dealership, or revenue share. Every kid who plays on the basketball team, gets 0.1% or something, whatever it is. If they had done that unilaterally and not gone the NCAA, to the Supreme Court, we would not have, the highest bidder and the kind of world that we live in. They basically, so once the Supreme Court found against the NCAA, it created this complete Wild West where money is, it's unbridled, and, super wealthy boosters are, they're paying millions and millions of dollars. And it's not really going to change until there's actually some sort of coming to the table of both sides. And that's, effectively collective bargaining, because all these rules are being made on one side of the equation with no buy-in from the athletes. And that's why we're in this landscape where everything seems crazy. So I think the long answer to your very short question is, I think there's a lot of misconceptions that this is just athletes who are greedy and they're just getting millions of dollars and everything's terrible. The truth is, there's no guardrails because the NCAA didn't want them and thought they would win. And they lost the ability once the Supreme Court ruled to basically regulate, because now the only way to get real laws and real things in place is to bring both sides to the table. And for whatever reason, that's not the approach they're taking.
All right. So when you talked about how NIL has changed in the past years, how do you think the future of it could change? Let's say in the next 5 to 10 years, do you think that these athletes could be given more money and get more just everything? Or do you think that maybe legally there could be a step in and maybe cause it to kind of stay where it is right now?
I think what is inevitable is there will be a federal law, but it will not be I don't think the only chance of having what's known as an antitrust exemption, which is what the various bills are being represented as right now. I mean, Tommy Tuberville has one. There's one, there was the SCORE Act. There's a bipartisan one that's also pending. But the reality is there's no appetite to give the NCAA an exemption where they get just an exemption would mean we can make all these rules, and there's no and we can enforce them unilaterally without the other side. No industry enjoys that in this country, or frankly in other countries. Like that's called a monopoly, right? If you have a corner on everything and you get to make the rules, right, you can't do that. Right. That's why these rules exist. So the only way to overcome the world that we have right now is one of two. One is the Republicans get their, Ted Cruz's Build the Score Act or some level thereof, where it just says, you know what, we're going to give the NCAA an exemption. So yeah, you can go back to the old days. That's not going to happen because, frankly, if it was going to happen, it would have happened already. Right now we have a Republican president, we have a Republican Congress, and even amongst, the same party, they see that there are problems with giving those exemptions. There's not unanimity, not a unanimous. I can't say unanimity right now for some reason, but the point is, I just don't believe that's going to pass. What I think is going to happen, I mean, again, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think this is just where things have to be headed, is it's not going to be what the Democrats, want, which is full employee status or full unionization, like in professional sports leagues like the NFL, the NBA. But there'll be some sort of hybrid. I think that's the only way forward, because in certain states, for example, there's laws that prohibit public employees to unionize. So you can't have a union that's just sort of all that covers all athletes. If it includes public universities. So what I think is going to ultimately happen is there will be some sort of hybrid kind of classification for athletes, not unlike how farm workers are different than regular employees. There's certain hybrid classifications. I think there'll be a new classification. I think that there will be some sort of collective bargaining, some sort of unionization, and the unions will not negotiate with the schools, which really, if you think about it, isn't very efficient. They'll negotiate with the conferences. And the biggest sticking point in kind of getting to this point is about media rights, because right now there's no ability to consolidate media rights. So the two largest power conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC, guess what? They don't want the ability of the other conferences to consolidate their media rights, because why? Because they have all the money right now, right? And that will take away their advantage. So there's a bit impasse in Congress because obviously the SEC and the Big Ten and their lobbyists don't want that, and they're pushing from the other side. But it's really not even necessarily all Republican on one side, Democrat the other. But the point is, until they kind of deal with media rights, that's the first thing. They have to deal with the media rights. And once the media rights prong is done, then I think we can go to the next step and getting some sort of structure and guardrails. And I think, last thing I'll just say is that the NCAA itself has lost total credibility. So I also envision that there will be a world where it's a different organizing body altogether. It won't be, it will be maybe reconstructed or renamed or whatever, but I don't think the NCAA itself has so little credibility at this point.
Okay, and for an NIL deal, who do you think is the most leverage? Is it the athlete? Is it the brand? Does it have to do with like the school? Like, who do you think is the most leverage when it comes to negotiations?
Well, when we talk about NIL deals, it's a little bit of a misnomer. We call NIL deals any money paid to an athlete. But, when you think about it, NIL stands for name, image, and likeness. And so it's literally if, hey, you want to, buy, a soda and Sam Lieben's name is next to it. Hey, Sam Lieben likes Coke. You should buy, Coke too. That's name, image, and likeness. You're being paid for holding the soda up, right? When you get paid from the schools, right, for your basketball skills, that's not name, image, and likeness. It's for your services. It's for playing basketball, right? That's why this is sort of silly. And so if we take it in two buckets, right? So if it's the car dealership or the soda company, right? That's, whatever, that's just, that's like anything else, whether if you're a celebrity, taking athletics out of it, right? If you like, Olivia Dean, right? And you think that you would, you love her music, and so you would buy, you'd buy Coke and not Pepsi. If she's holding a Coke, she can command. She has a certain following, but she's not Madonna or whatever, the Beatles. Like, she's not of the ages, but she's an up and coming, and she's very, she's selling out Madison Square Garden, right? So the in the brand deals, like anything else, it's the level of celebrity and maybe the followers and that kind of stuff. But when we come down to it, I think when you're asking me the question, you're asking about, like, more about, is can Lenberg, right, from Michigan, right? I mean, I think he's out of eligibility, but let's say he had another year, right? In order for Michigan to keep him, right? If they paid him $2 million this year and they just won a national championship, right? He's obviously got the leverage, right? He was, he was, the engine on that team, and he did amazing stuff, and so he's got the leverage. On the other hand, the guy who sits on the bench at Michigan, he was part of that national championship team too. But if he didn't do anything and he scored, and he averaged 1 point per game, and maybe they paid him $1 million or more, like, sort of significantly. Think about some of the guys who were highly paid in the portal, and they fizzled out, right? And I'm a Tar Heel, right? And if you could go on and you Google, Tar Heel fans, and there are certain people that they felt they massively overpaid and they didn't perform, right? And people are mad because they're getting paid. So some of it is, what is the need, maybe one of the, and I won't name any of them because I don't begrudge any athlete. I think there's so much that's owed to athletes. So I think you make the best deal you can. But the point simply is, in the off season, we're in portal season right now, right? People, the school will have a need. They need a big, right? They're graduating, and they know that if they don't have a big, if they don't have the right roster construction, they're not going to be able to compete next year. And especially if you're at a blue blood, right? That's not acceptable. So if there are only so many bigs, and once you've identified, and the athlete will know who you've got and who's graduating, it's not like you can hide that. There is leverage. But again, if you think now downstream, the kid who played at a mid-major who maybe, wants to go to a high major, he has less leverage, right? Because he's kind of trading up and he wants to maybe he thinks he can go to the next level and he needs to go to a Carolina or a Michigan or wherever. So I think the leverage really is like in any other business transaction. It's about what the need of the buyer is and the need of the seller. And, I think that's where it comes from.
Okay, and so just to, like, name some names, like, what are some college athletes that you yourself have represented?
Well, there's a lot that I can't tell you because, of course, some of those are
That's
private
fair.
deals.
That's fair.
But I've sued the NCAA 5 times in court all over the country. A case I did very recently involved, myself and my team at the law firm. We represented Puff Johnson, who this most recently played at Ohio State. His brother Cam Johnson, people will know from the NBA. He was on the Nets for a little bit.
I love that guy. I love them.
Cam's awesome, and so is Puff. They're a great family, and that was, it was a great case to do. And I mean, I've done lesser known ones, but a football player from the University of Southern Mississippi, which is where Brett Favre played. He's a left tackle. He's now, in the midst of draft preparations. And part of the reason that this work has been so rewarding is, it's not. And to use players that from my alma mater, like Drake May or Michael Jordan, right? They don't really need a lawyer like me, right? They're amazing, right? They don't, and the world is at their feet. But each of those guys are one of one, and you can name whatever your favorite all-star is in whatever sport that you play. To me, what it's about is representing the guys who maybe you don't know their name unless you're a super fan, right? But making sure that they didn't get, nobody's looking for 10 years or 8 years. Everyone's just looking to make sure that their time playing is both meaningful, that they've had, 4 meaningful seasons or 5 if that's, appropriate given, the years. And that if they didn't, like in Puff's case, you know, he does have an opportunity to play at the next level. I don't know if he's going to go to the NBA or overseas, but he needed the development. And he was, he was injured and he was misdiagnosed and through no fault of his own. So to me, what I've really been so fortunate to do in this space is really, not dissimilar to being a prosecutor, is really analyzing the facts of each individual case, whether in the DA's office, it's maybe a company or a worker or an abused woman, and figuring out what the best way and most efficient way to make for justice. And I get to do the fight, and I can kind of take some of that psychic energy off of my client, or the victim in those cases, and also be really mindful that in private practice, obviously it costs money for people to hire me, but there's always a psychic cost to doing litigation. So you want to make sure that the case you go beyond the dollar signs and making sure that the case is worth it for the toll that it takes on people. So I know I got a little beyond like naming names, but to me, I think it's important to know that every athlete, when you get to a Division I level, these are talented people who've not had, and I know you're still in high school, but you'll see, when you go to college, there's a lot of freedom, and it's really amazing to be a college student, right? But Division I athletes, they don't have the experience that you likely and I did, right? It really is like working a job, and they need to have protections, and they need to be fairly compensated for what they've done or do.
Okay. So I actually really appreciate you going off the naming names. That was pretty good stuff. So, if you could give one piece of advice to an athlete that enters the NIL space, what would it be?
I mean, I think in terms of, if you're going to play Division I think it's always important to know what your worth is and be humble. Understand that, kids can start. I mean, obviously there's a lot of stories. There's a couple of years ago, and I think he's still at the Lakers, like Dalton Connect, right? Dalton Connect is a really good example of a player that started out in the mid-major. I believe he was at the University of Northern Colorado, right? And he just blew up, right? He really developed. And, in the cases of other clients of mine, like, because you guys are young, right? And guys, and women too, for that matter, like we grow later, we develop in different levels. And, so in the case of Dalton Connect, right, he went from a mid-major player with no NIL to going to the University of Tennessee and being, on the short list for the Naismith Award, and ultimately being a first-round draft pick and now playing in the NBA, right? Or think about like Danny Wolf, right? Like he played at Yale, right? I mean, amazing school, but the Ivy League hasn't been, super relevant in the athletic space, since probably the 1950s. But he was good enough and got Yale further than most Ivy Leagues get in the tournament, and he then transferred to Michigan last year, and now he's playing in the NBA. And I think that's the thing. I think you have to know, you have to be patient. You have to know, you have to be realistic, and you have to also kind of be willing to kind of bet on yourself. I think too is really important in athletics. If you can do, and you outwork people, half the time that really more than talent, it's really about having the right mental space and the work ethic to go further.
Okay. Now, you talked about your pivot from the law enforcement and construction scene to now athletics. If you had found out about NIL deals earlier in your career, do you think you would have maybe pivoted earlier, maybe went right into NIL, or do you think you would have still chosen your path that you had?
Well, NIL deals didn't really exist before 2021. They were illegal. So I
Good
actually
point. Good
got
point.
in. So I got in just as things were happening. And that's part of what was interesting. I'll say this is that one of the reasons I like being a lawyer is because the law is very dynamic, and new areas of the law, pop up, as the world changes. So for example, cryptocurrency, right, didn't exist, I don't know, 30 years ago. If it did, I didn't know about it, right, in the 90s, right? But it certainly has sort of been, emerged as a thing in the last 20 years or so. And, data privacy, all those areas are, computer crimes. When I was, I remember when I came back from maternity leave with my oldest daughter, in late '01, early '02. I remember hearing there might be a computer crimes unit. Like I was like, what kind of computer crimes? Like it was so at the dawn of the internet age, right? But if you think about it, my daughter is going to turn 25, and the world has, significantly changed, in terms of the way, crimes can be committed. You can be defrauded by someone, on the other side of the world, right? So different areas of the law emerge at different times. And one of the great things about being a lawyer is that you can, if you catch it at the right moment, you can get in early. And so with NIL, if you will, in sports, obviously sports law has been around for as long as professional sports been around. But the college space, which I find to be particularly interesting, because you get someone as they're sort of at the beginning of their careers. Some of them are going to go on to professional careers. Some of my clients are, and I get to be part of that journey with them and watch and try to get them to the next level. So I don't know that I don't know that I was in the right space. I liked sports, but I wasn't necessarily going to be a sports lawyer. But to me, I don't see athletes, as I said, it's not so much about the games they play, it's about the people that they are, and making sure that people who have an incredible talent aren't exploited and have the ability to maximize their value when they're able to play. And then afterwards, I have a separate consulting, arm that I do, where we help, within the high school space and sort of high school, leagues and academies and things like that. And my business partner there is a former, NBA veteran. Was on an NCAA championship team at the Carolina in 1993. And he's my age, right? He's in his 50s, and he's still amazing, and he looks amazing. He's in great shape. But George can't dunk anymore. You know what I mean? You have to be able to do stuff and have a really great, after career. The idea that I can help be part of someone's journey, so that when they can no longer dunk, that they can still have, a great future and be able to have a good livelihood. So that's part of the fun of this area of the law.
All right, and so shifting back to also like NIL deals changing. Not sure if you mentioned this or not. If so, just stop me. But um, would you say that social media has had like a very huge impact on the NIL scene as it's been growing since 2021?
I mean, I think what's interesting is when we think about NIL, and again, let's use it in the form of, like, when you mentioned social media, right? If you have 1 million followers, whether you're an athlete, whether you're an influencer, whatever, you can be compensated. And so what's interesting is when it comes to women, women's sports, some of the best NIL kind of earners on that front are women, because a lot of women athletes, female athletes, are really good on the social media space. Others, it's more like we follow, the XYZ athlete, but it's not really his interest. So it's interesting because social media is a way for women, female athletes, to kind of be in the space, and to make money. But I think the dark side of social media, of course, I mean, we've seen it, right? I mean, if an athlete makes a mistake, I mean, I remember, and again, I'm a Tar Heel, so take this for what it is, and Caden Boozer, right? If he just held the ball after, against UConn, right? Duke would have been, in the Elite Eight, right? Not UConn, right? I mean, they were basically up. Now, that was a mistake, and that's awful. Pre-social media, I'm sure the pundits would talk about it, but what was awful is that, I mean, I don't know how many tens of thousands of people were saying horrible, horrible things about an 18-year-old kid who, at the end of the day, yes, he was highly compensated as a member of the Duke basketball team. And again, I'm a Tar Heel, and they're my rival, but I did not like seeing the abuse that he suffered, and again, he's not the first and he won't be the last, and that's something that we need to be really mindful about in social media. Is I think people need to learn that these are real people. That's a real kid, and of course he didn't want to make that mistake. I mean, he would have liked to have been in the Final Four. And I think sometimes people forget the people on the court are still people. So I think that social media um, can be obviously extremely damaging. So I think we have to be better. And I think NCAA should frankly be doing more, with the billions that they make in March Madness. There should be funding towards educating and helping, kids handle that stuff, because whether you're the hero one day or the villain, again, he wasn't a villain. He made a terrible mistake, and he feels probably worse than anybody. But yeah, I would say that. And then the last thing I'll mention about social media, and really where it's, and that there's some laws that are pending, is with prop bets, right? I mean, we have a situation where, you can bet on how many free throws he'll make or whatever, or are you going to, how many points or how many, if he's going to get a double. And I remember, again, an athlete that played at Carolina who was very beloved, Armando Bacot, talked about all his DMs filling up when, he didn't have because he pretty much had like a double every game practically. And, the time that he didn't, like, he got death threats. I mean, that's absolutely, that's the very toxic side of social media. So we need to be doing a better job, I think, of protecting athletes. And I think part of that is getting some of the gambling stuff in line, and making sure there are stronger penalties for people that do, threaten people. There are criminal, I mean, frankly, it's criminal. But we need to have better enforcement and mechanisms to make sure that we protect our athletes.
All right, so last question here. So if you could speak to a kid, they're fresh out of college, they want to enter the sports law scene, what's one piece of advice that you would give to them?
And I think it's really important to really understand what this space is. And I think if you're in college and you can be part of the athletics department, I would say go volunteer, go work as a manager, or work with the teams, work with the athletes, kind of understand that. I didn't do that, of course, that wasn't my interest, but I do think that there's a lot of people in the sports law space who previously were athletes themselves, and it definitely helps if you have a background, even if you didn't play in college, even if you played in high school. I think really drawing on that. I think anytime that you have an ability to connect with people, and I find with myself who didn't play, and my kids didn't play, Division I sports, but I can connect with them on different, places, where my kids are, wanting to go. What my daughter wants to be, my daughter works for Saturday Night Live. She works in an area that's very, very hard to break into. So I can kind of, you find parallels where you can. But I think if you are graduating college and you're not going to law school yet and you want to work in sports, I think it's important to try to, I would say it would be really important to try to get an internship, either with an agency or with, working for a team. It doesn't have to be a professional sports team. Again, I think at any university, even a Division III, there are a plethora of sports teams. And if you understand more about the dynamics of athletics, college athletics, what athletes do, you're going to be much better off than someone who just came out of nowhere.
All right, Diana, thank you very much for your time and joining us today. We really all appreciate it. And I guess we'll give a round of applause. I'll give you one. And
Thank you.
thank you very much for being here. For those watching on YouTube, if you subscribe, you can get videos just like these at any time. Turn that notification bell on. And to those listening on Spotify, thank you very much. We'll see you in the next episode. Thank you, Diana. And
Thank
see
you.
you all next time on Behind the Deal.